Hey, Meg and Dr. G here for Sportlight Sport Report, and today we're putting the spotlight on Dr. Sara Erdner. Sara received her PhD from the University of Tennessee in sports psychology and is a certified CMPC mental performance consultant for coaches as well as youth, college, Olympic, and professional athletes. Among other things, Sara has come to us to talk about her new book, Dear Coach. Sara, we're so happy to have you with us. Welcome to Sportlight.
Thanks for having me. It's so wonderful to be here. To meet you, Megan, to see you again, G.
Yeah, you got to say how you guys know each other.
How do we know each other? I feel
Uh,
like there's so many starter stories.
some of your faculty threw you underneath the proverbial bus and said, you know what, why don't you just deal with G a little bit, And
Yeah, I do. I
I'm
think I
so
blacked that out,
sorry.
actually. I think I blacked that out. So I'm so glad you brought that back when that happened. No, yeah, I was introduced to you. You were a fifth member of my dissertation committee that um, I had a lot of very compassionate people on my dissertation committee that dealt with me with very gentle hands. And then G would come in and be like, get it together. And I was like, oh God, okay, yeah. Or I would get off rails and he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right. So you were the very critical portion of kept me on task, got me to graduation, all that stuff.
That perfectly opens Sara up to tell us a story that is my favorite story that you have told about a teacher that came in. And you know exactly which one I'm talking about. So go ahead. I love that.
Well, I have to give credit where credit is due on this one. So Dr. Cheekus was my sociology of sport professor at University of Tennessee. And so he did this. This is what inspired me doing this in class, where I was teaching methods of coaching. I think this is the story you're talking about, where I walk in. And I was in methods of coaching. I was talking about abuse and how sport is a place where we can get away with abuse and there's nothing that holds people accountable to not doing it. And I always have the student in the back of the class that'll raise their hand and be like, well, I need that. Like, I need the coach to abuse me. They don't necessarily say that, but that's what they're saying. And I proceeded, my 5'5" petite body, I'm usually a very joyful person, I flipped a table, threw my textbook up against the whiteboard, started yelling profanity, getting in students' faces, saying F you for not making an A on that last assignment, like get the fuck out of my class, like just the whole 9 yards. Everybody's face was, I mean, the look, I wish I had a video of it. And then I paused. I caught my breath because I kind of scared myself to doing it. And I said, okay, who in here is more motivated to make better grades? And they got the point. I said, you essentially, if I came in here every day and did this as if what coaches do in locker rooms out on the field, I would be fired within a week, if not by the end of the semester, because we don't tolerate that in academia, but we do in sport. And what's the difference? And so, but Dr. Cheekus did that in our sociology of sport class in 2015 is when I took that course. And it has stuck with me ever since, to the point that it inspired that very impromptu session, of which I followed up profusely apologizing, giving them the contact information for the counseling center in case that was triggering. I contacted Afton, our director of counseling. I was like, hey, I did this. If anybody contacts you, I want you to know what I did. I own up to it. So yeah, but that was the students they got it in that moment. And then my punchline was, sport often makes people immune to abuse, because in order to survive sport, you have to become immune to abuse. And there's a lot of external factors that influence that. Parents that are pressuring the kid to play the sport. Also the pressure of, you have to do well in sport in high school to get that scholarship so you can go to college. If not, you can't go. So there's a lot of things in that, but I don't think that should allow abuse to continue. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell, throwing tables around in the classroom. So
Love that story. And as an athlete, you're like, yeah, that's totally how my coach was. And I was supposed to be motivated by that. And you know what? I wasn't, but I knew I was supposed to be. So it's kind of a weird thing that we've all just been kind of brought up to feel that that's the way it's supposed to be.
yeah, and one of the things in the clinical setting, and so I'm not clinical by any means. Again, I'm a certified mental performance consultant, but we do learn about the clinical side in order to refer out. And one of the things that was fascinating to me when it comes to counseling is this, when you grow up in a home, for example, that's dysfunctional, in order to survive that home, you have to create a false self, which is, again, isn't your authentic self. And we've done that in sport, where you have created what you just said. I know that I don't really like it, but I have to, be immune to it in order to survive. And so you create a false sense as an athlete, a false self as an athlete to survive. And so my argument is, we know in the literature, the more authentic you can feel, the safer you can feel, the higher levels of optimal performance. But we just have a lot of athletes running around with false senses of self so that they can survive the coach athlete relationship, maybe even the parent athlete relationship, we've really fooled ourselves into thinking that we've seen optimal performance, because I don't think we have, because we don't have a safe environment for authentic self to flourish.
Real quick, there's a difference between, and so I'm going to come back to multiple things, but you want to give, Sarah, I can do it too. Do you want to talk real quickly about the clinical side of things, clinical side of psychology versus the sport performance psychology side, and kind of what that means for people that are in the know, that are in the field, to understand the use of the term psychologist and what mental performance consultants and that kind of difference real quick. I don't think it's a big deal.
Yeah, wonderful point. So I'm a certified mental performance consultant. The best way I can put it is I help an athlete take what's good and help them get to great. So it's that kind of really small percentage. I'm not dealing with any clinical aspect. I have an understanding of the clinical side, so I can refer. So if I see signs and symptoms of depression, suicidal ideation, any of that, I know how to handle that referral process. And so the clinical side is that you're dealing with just the mental health of a human being that just so happens to be an athlete. And kind of it's more overarching in that nature. We have a lot of things in the field right now trying to do some 2-for-1s, like clinical, as well as, do some mental skills on the side. That is not, we don't necessarily promote that, because they're two different things, two different types of relationships you're building with an athlete. So, but I do heavily understand that an athlete is a person first. And so making sure that you're keeping an eye out for mental health as well. So yeah, that's it. My answer in a nutshell.
Well, that's a great segue into Sarah telling us a little bit about how she grew up around sports and how you got into the field.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I was actually just writing an excerpt for my new book last night about this, but I came out of the womb, I feel like, running laps. Like I was just an active kid. I just knew I was an athlete from such a young age. So I started with softball year round, anything I could do to be active. So softball, basketball, volleyball thrown in the mix. I even remember very vividly having an off day from all the sports, and I couldn't handle it. So I just started running laps around our house. Literally, like, for the intrinsic joy of moving my body. Like, it was, my parents were not telling me to do it. They were actually like, hello, like, what are you doing? I just loved moving my body.
And you grew up in Alabama, right?
I did, yes.
Well, I mean, when you grew up in Alabama, what else are you going to do besides run around the house?
Stop it.
You go play in the creek down the road.
That is very true. We were very outdoor kids. But I just always had a love of movement, like my body moving. I was fascinated with it. And so did a lot of that. I did triathlons as a club sport in college. And then Garrity, I think we also bonded too. I had broken my foot. I have a really weird kind of transition in my sport life. So I did 6 years of triathlons, broke my foot. I was in the middle of my PhD, and I was like, by the time I got back from my broken foot, it was going to take so much effort to get back into triathlon shape. I come from a very muscular, strong family that does a lot of strength sports. And so my uncles were always like, Sarah, what the heck are you doing endurance sports? So then I just decided, okay, I think this is my time to shine. And I registered for a strong woman competition with my then PhD colleague. She's another student, Jess Siegel. and we trained for a strong woman competition, got basically competed in that for a while, did CrossFit. So yeah, then I transitioned, was a strength athlete. So I was doing all of that while I was doing sports psychology, my PhD. My first 2 degrees I were in communication studies, so my undergrad and my master's, and that really helps inform the work that I did in my PhD and now, which is really just helping people start the conversation, because I don't think we're communicating properly in order to create a safe environment within sports. So my experiences have informed why I've gotten to where I'm at today to write a book called Dear Coach, because I've had my own experiences with coaches, and also have listened to my teammates and interviewed coaches and really realized like that's what people want to hear. They want to know what athletes think.
What do you know, they'll be like, oh, this is a typical G question then, but what do you think about your transition from communication studies into sports psychology? What did you see as the opportunities for additional insight, the lenses and questions that people weren't asking, or, things that you saw that were common in sports psych and you were like, huh, like it strikes me as a little bit odd or different than, the rich field also of communication studies.
Yeah, for me, so it's communication studies undergrad masters with an emphasis in interpersonal communication. And so learning about uncertainty reduction theory was my first theoretical love, which is that uncertainty is uncomfortable. And so there's 7 axioms out there in the world on how to reduce it. Since then, there's things called uncertainty management theory. There's a couple of additions to URT, uncertainty reduction theory, that it's not about trying to reduce it, but maybe manage it. And then if we look at it through a mindfulness lens, it's not about trying to manage or reduce it. We just want to be considerate of it, right? Like, I feel uncertain right now. But that was what really was a lens that I was using in my master's degree. And my master's thesis related to parent communication patterns and how those patterns influence student athlete self-efficacy. And in a very quick nutshell, the research was demonstrating that controlling parents, so those that use unidirectional communication, my way or the highway, I'm right, you're wrong, had a detrimental effect on student athlete self-efficacy, where the parents that were more communicative, bidirectional communication, hey, how did you think that competition went? I would love to know your thoughts on it. That had a positive influence on student athlete self-efficacy. So all that time I was doing that, I was interested in communication and sport. And then Becky, my PhD advisor at the time, was on my master's thesis committee. She's actually the one that was like, yo, you should think about a PhD in sports psych. So it wasn't on my radar. But what I noticed in interpersonal communication is we learn a lot about people as beings, because that's who you're dealing with in interpersonal communication. And I was really at the time very interested, because I am a white female that grew up in the South, but I felt like a fish out of water because I don't identify heavily with the very conservative Southern values that I was raised around. And so that really got me thinking about people as cultural beings. When I got to my PhD, I started, Dr. Leslie Fisher introduced me to relational cultural theory, which is not a sports psych theory. It's one that is couched within feminine psychology, feminism. And so I started kind of patching everything together and thinking, wow, like one of the things I don't see sports psychology doing that I noticed in my communication degrees is that we're not getting to the base. We talk about a humanistic approach, right? Like athletes are humans first, but they're cultural beings first. Like we need to call people what we are, which is we're cultural, and you can't be identity blind to a person if you're truly dealing with a human. So how can we make Black bodies, female bodies, LGBTQIA bodies, all these marginalized bodies feel safe, as well as, and one of the things I'm also passionate about is making male bodies feel safe. And what I mean by that is, yes, I think white men in particular, able-bodied middle-class men, have been more privileged, but the patriarchy screws them over too. They don't give them a choice on what kind of man they want to be. You know, there's one mold that you have to be, and especially in sport. And so how can we make all bodies feel safe and then we can get to optimal performance. So having better interpersonal relationships via that cultural component to get to optimal performance.
You said before, culture heals. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, culture, that was a very, something for me that's also personal and scientific, because I, as a white person, had the privilege of not waking up every day being reminded that I was white. I, for the most part, have had the privilege of being around communities that champion women. And so I've had the privilege of having great women mentors to where I'm not waking up every day being reminded I'm a woman. I have a PhD, I have a lot of privilege. But as I started really leaning into culture, meaning the culture that the United States is under, the racism, how racism not only hurts Black bodies, but it also hurts the oppressor. And so it literally, the cognitive dissonance that racism causes within a white person's body, generationally, so the generational trauma that we feel, we are also hurting ourselves. And so for not just asking marginalized people to heal themselves based on their culture, right? Like, oh, you need to heal these transgressions, but asking privileged bodies to lean into the culture that they were brought up in, being real, very critically real about the narratives we heard growing up. For me, I was raised in the state of Alabama in a church that liked to call itself non-denominational, but had tinges of Southern Baptist nature. And, really digging in and being honest with myself, there was a lot of patriarchal, sexist, racist narratives, not just in the church, but everybody I was raised around. And so in culture heals, meaning that when you can be real with yourself on how your positionality has influenced your lens, your worldview, you can start to understand how you have potentially harmed others unintentionally, maybe. And so I've had to come to that hard truth for myself and really deal with the guilt that I have felt, trying to do good, but realizing that I wasn't really being an anti-racist. So that's I could go on and on about that, but I think that once we start interacting with ourselves as cultural beings, we understand our positionality, then we can hopefully start to help permitting others to see themselves as such.
Let me do the professorial breakdown real quick because there's a lot of things.
You're like,
I know. I'm
next,
like, I got to.
next.
Well, there's a lot. I want to make sure that people are listening and can really follow along and understand. And then we can go further with all those kind of things that you just discussed. Because it's a lot of big words. Okay. So one, self-efficacy is just the basic, the academic way of saying not quite self-confidence, but the belief that you can do something and that you have the power and the capacity to do something. So I have self-efficacy to jump and touch the rim, or to that I can get this hit in this high pressure situation. So it's that kind of confidence that you believe that you can execute it. So just so we're clear on self-efficacy. Okay, then we talked about, or you brought up big things too related to privilege, oppression, dissonance, and patriarchy. So there's a lot of kind of big words in there too. And I just real briefly, right? Privilege being, we can quickly define it as some sort of asset or some sort of unearned asset or skill or tool advantage that somebody has. All right. And there's a lot of, and I say that right because too, I've written about privilege and it gets thrown around and people talk about it without actually starting to break it down, or you listen to one thing. Okay. And again, I'm just one thing to one person saying it, but that's how I have come to know, understand privilege. Oppression would be some sort of systematic or systemic group of people dominating over another people and keeping them down or oppressed. Okay. And then dissonance is some sort of conflict or internal turmoil when you experience a new idea or conflicting ideas, something like that. And then patriarchy, more simpler, of a male kind of dominance or something like that, and ideologies and power that keep men in positions of power.
And we're going to have a quiz for all our viewers and listeners at the end
I
of
know.
the episode, just to make sure. No, I mean, this is why we're doing this, is to
Yeah, wonderful.
introduce these types of terms and concepts. So,
where do you see too, perhaps the intersection of, because right, we got to get to talking about the book, about great coaching, poor coaching, abusive coaching, and we can get into the nuances of that, but also the intersecting, because I won't say I was surprised, but I noticed in the book when you started really talking and breaking down more about cultural identities and again, positionalities, right? Where does somebody situate their identity and their positionality is how we call it, and you start bringing that more into the conversation and intersecting that with larger discourse around quality and coaching. That's novel for the field.
Really, that enlightened me when I did my dissertation, because as you know, we have to, as PhDs, aspiring PhDs, you have to write that positionality statement so that you can understand as the interviewer. So I did qualitative interviews, interviewing athletes about their experience with coaches, but you first have to write that positionality statement of who are you, and so how could you as the interviewer be where your biases and assumptions lie, and how could those biases and assumptions be informed by your position? So you're a white woman interviewing a black man, right? And how could the way that you ask the questions maybe change the tone of that interview, or it's going to influence what you may or may not probe in the interview, right? And so positionality, that I became so woke of like, wow, now I'm starting to see how I move in this world more when I started understanding just being real with who I am. I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual, educated woman that was raised in the South by a heterosexual, non-divorced family in a non-denominational / Southern Baptist church. Just like all of those things are influencing one another and playing together to influence how I perceive the world, interact with the world, how I walk into a space, without even saying anything. And I thought, why are we not doing this with coaches? And one of the things too, we have so many, the first thing I teach methods of coaching classes. And the first thing you do is like, okay, we're going to learn about coaching philosophies. And at the end of class, we're going to write one. And I get so annoyed because they're all values-based, like values-based coaching philosophies, which is great. I love values. And at the same time, those values are influenced by our positionality, right? Like if you say your number one value is work ethic, well, is the patriarchy influencing that, right? Like you were born in a capitalistic culture, so are you saying work ethic just because you think, like, what's influencing you choosing that? If we can get coaches to understand themselves, their position more, and how just their presence alone, based on the social narratives that surround what it means to be a white person, and how that could trigger a black person or a female being positioned next to a male coach, then we can learn how to navigate that relationship a little bit differently, under like interacting as cultural bodies first, and then we can get to maybe Sophia Jowett's work on the 3 Cs+1 on closeness, commitment, co-orientation, complementarity, after we get that foundation of, hey, we're cultural beings first. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. So that's where I think it is pretty novel, bringing culture in and infusing it in what we do.
And you go to the way that it can really be harmful or negatively affect, or maybe the unintended consequences of those underlying values that we really don't maybe analyze or know where they come from. And not even going back. And so that's a great angle, as well as it reminds me of, I'm sitting here looking it up, making sure, right? Weber's work on Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, that's very, 100 plus years old, and that, the founding of America was built on that. And there's a lot of folks that, right, we live in our today's age. We don't go back to history to understand often, why we are the way that we are today, and why the whatever we want to call them, ideologies, discourses, theory, practice, and that embeds itself in coaching. And a lot of coaches too are surprised for example, to learn about the similarities between the military and sport. And that comes from a lot of coaches at the turn of the century being involved in the military. You know it at Tennessee, General Nealand, and everybody that was serving in the military at the time. And that's different than it was in the last 40 years. But those practices and that discipline is still embedded in the work ethic and the accountability, and those really big values are still there. So yes, I would encourage, all coaches to not just realize that, what they perceive they value, but how those perceptions were developed over time.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. And join in the conversation around this topic and more in the forum.